Hi, everyone. My name is Ajay Parasram, and I'm here with my pal, Alex Kasnabish. Welcome to Safe Space for White Questions. This is, before I get started, I just wanted to say, obviously, for those of you who have never been to our sessions before, this is now our fifth session, and we're broadcasting to you from unceded Mi'kma'ki, the unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. You're streaming from wherever it is that you are. We wanted to just quickly say a few words about what this is all about. You can find the archived versions of our previous sessions, the last 4 or 5 sessions, on YouTube. Basically what we're doing here is we wanted to create a space where white people with good intentions who maybe feel like they can't ask certain kinds of questions in social justice settings could just comfortably come and pose a question anonymously if they wish, and get a really honest and frank answer from two people who, by no means are like experts on everything, but have been engaged in this kind of work through activism as well as scholarship. So that's basically what we're about. My name is Ajay Parasram. I'm a professor in the Department of International Development Studies and History at Dalhousie University in Chibuktuk. I'm a multi-generational transnational byproduct of empire, particularly the British Empire, and my people came originally from what is called North India, displaced in the 19th century through political economic colonialism to the Southern Caribbean, where my people were scattered across 19 different countries, and then ultimately moved again across Algonquin territories, Coast Salish territories in the west, and then Mi'kmaq territories here out east. And I bring that kind of lived experience to my work as well. So I'm going to just pass it over to my pal Alex, who will tell you a little bit about himself before we get started with your questions. And just a reminder, you can still be submitting questions live as we're going, and then it'll pop up on our screens and we'll take them in turn. So Alex, over to you.
Thanks, AJ. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to this ongoing series, Safe Spaces for White Questions. My name is Alex Kasnabish. I'm a professor at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory. I'm just going to give you a quick intro to me before we get going. I am a professor in sociology and anthropology at the Mount, and my activism and research interests have long revolved around questions of social justice, social change, social movements, and now I'm very much interested in studying fascism and the resurgence of white supremacy, white power politics in the global north. I originally hail from Toronto, Ontario, on the territories of the Haudenosaunee people. I have been in Nova Scotia now for nearly a decade and a half. I like to describe myself, I guess, as an ambiguously racialized person. I've been grown up on Canadian state territory, but my people come from India and Latvia. That's where my mom and my dad come from, and I'm a first-generation Canadian here, very much a settler in terms of my own identity on these territories, and looking for ways to decolonize my own presence here, as well as to struggle towards some meaningful form of collective liberation for all of us. So that's, I think, enough about me right now. Why don't we get going with your questions in this discussion? Thanks again for joining us. So I'm going to throw it back to AJ.
Great. Okay, thanks very much for that. And just before I read the first question, I also wanted to acknowledge that this is the first time that we're working with Fernwood Publishing to run our tech for us. And I just wanted to offer some appreciation for Fernwood. They kind of saw our low-tech situation over the last few months and volunteered to help us out. So thank you, Fernwood, for that support. So the first question coming from the audience is, can white people be victims of racism? So this is a recurring question for us, and that's totally fine. I think to get at the answer to the question, we have to first start by thinking about what race and racism is. So fundamentally, racism is like race is a discursive thing. Race doesn't exist. So let's start by saying there's no such thing as race in a biological sense. But because it is a discursive thing and an expression of power, historically, race has been predicated on the presentation of binaries, blackness and whiteness. Whiteness being on like one side of this binary, and another way to think about racism is to think about how people are structurally advantaged or disadvantaged on the basis of these arbitrary figures, whether it could have been noses, it could have been eyes, but it was skin color, it was melanin. That was the way that things went. So as a system of power that is then kind of streamed through all forms of society across many different intersections, white people can't be the victims of a system of oppression that has been designed to serve whiteness. And the only caveat that I would add to that before passing it to Alex to elaborate on is that this doesn't preclude people of color, indigenous people, black people, etc., from being assholes. You know what I mean? Like, there's a really important difference between somebody who's a jerk, and I know lots, and somebody who has the position of structural advantage, of unearned privilege, who acts on that privilege. And that's the really important part. So, and I know this is a bit controversial in some circles, but in my opinion, I don't think white people can be the victims of racism. They can be the victims of many other things, but it just doesn't make sense historically. So I'll pass it over to Alex to add his 2 cents on that.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that. My simple answer to this question is that no, in our current social order, white people cannot be victims of racism. It's impossible to be racist against white people in a white supremacist society. That doesn't mean white people's lives aren't hard. That doesn't mean white people aren't victims of all kinds of violence. It doesn't mean white people don't struggle. None of that is the case. Obviously, all those experiences are very real. But what we need to understand, as AJ's already said, and I'm just going to double down on here and invoke my anthropological credentials in doing so, I suppose, is that the race is a fiction. Like, people have a hard time wrapping their heads around this. But like any story, it's no less powerful for being untrue. So there's no such thing as the existence of distinct and identifiable separate human groups that we can neatly configure as races. And if you doubt me, which is fine, you can go ask the American Association of Human Geneticists, who a couple of years ago had to come out with, this is the biggest professional organization of human geneticists on the planet, had to release a statement saying, not only is race a bogus biological notion, in other words, it doesn't exist. We look at the human genetic code and there's no gene for race, but also they had to object to the way that racist ideas and popularized racist science were being used to support inequality and oppression and other forms of violence in society. And they said, you can't do that. There's no evidence for the hierarchical ordering of different groups of people on this planet. So that means race isn't real from a scientific perspective, but obviously I think, we could all understand just by reading the newspaper or looking in the world around us that race is very much real in terms of the way that people navigate their day-to-day realities. So in those realities, some groups are positioned above others, and that work has been centuries in the making. We could, talk endlessly about how that happened. But obviously in this part of the world and in the global north generally, what we've seen, and indeed I would argue on a global scale, we've seen the emergence of a white supremacist political and economic and social order that privileges people who are white identified and above and over people who are not white identified. And so in that system, certain people's lives are made much more vulnerable, oppressed, exploited as a result of their arbitrary identification with supposedly lower human groups. And that's all nonsense, but that's powerful. and it shaped our world. So in that world, no, and this has nothing to do with your own interior life or your feelings. In that world, we're thrust into that world, we're born into that world. In a white supremacist world, it's impossible to be racist against the people that order systematically privileges. Just like under patriarchy, men aren't oppressed as men, right? Men can live shitty lives. Men can live horrible, degraded, oppressed lives in different ways and according to different experiences and ways they're positioned in society. But as men, we are not oppressed. We're not denied control of our biological function, for example, in the same way that women are. So I'm going to leave it at there because I could rant about this forever. But I think it's something that, as AJ said so matter of factly, I think, and I'll just finish by reiterating the notion that that means all whites are bad and all people of color are somehow good. That's not the case either. Like, you can have lots of terrible ideas in your head about all kinds of other groups of people, but racism is a power relationship in society. So we're not talking about individual bad feelings. You can be a prejudiced person of any skin color, but when we talk about racism, we're talking about a structured power relationship. And so we're not talking about individual feelings. I'm going to leave it at that.
All right. So the next question we have is a little bit festive for the occasion. When I challenge some of the deep entrenched racist assumptions within my family gatherings, I feel like many of them are just rolling their eyes and thinking that I'll ultimately change my own thinking when I get older. How can I make my interventions more impactful? So this is like a nice dense question for us to sink our teeth into here, and there's a lot happening here to pick out. I believe the question will be soon floating in front of your screen so you can look at it. So I think what I would say to this is that when you're in your family gatherings, you're not being seen in the way that you might outwardly represent yourself away from your family. The family dynamic, particularly around the holidays, takes on a whole other set of assumptions, agitations, irritations, and emotions that you need to kind of be aware of. And I think, so I'm envisioning right now, like a big table full of people and turkeys and whatnot and cranberry sauce. And immediately what I'm thinking of is the intergenerational aspect of this. So it may be the case that, you're not going to convince your uncle or your grandfather or your grandmother or something that, their views about Black people or their views about Indigenous people is just fundamentally wrong. Because they will always have the sort of benefit of time to say, well, you weren't there in the 60s, you weren't there in the 70s, you didn't see what I see. And that's true. And you shouldn't try and fight them on that because you didn't see what they see. It doesn't mean that it's right. But I would say try to think about the younger generation sitting around the table. So when you intervene, when you try and stop, make an intervention in the kind of intergenerational learning of subtle racism, what you're doing is you're serving the interest of the younger people who are looking for guidance in terms of, to know that this is not okay. And to know that there's another way of thinking. And oftentimes those are not people who are going to be able to come to your aid in a family debate, but they're listening nonetheless. In terms of how are you going to, the thing is, you're not going to get through to everybody. So you really have to choose your battles, particularly when you're talking about family. But I think there's something else subtle in this question, which is that, they think that you are going to change your mind as you get older. And in a way, what that is that's an acknowledgement of how racist thinking replicates itself over generations. Because the fact of the matter is most people do gradually change their mind in kind of non-progressive ways. This is like the very operation of like conservatism is to conserve an idea across generations simply because it's tradition. So it's important, I think, to remind yourself that simply because something is traditional or because something is something that you've always done at home, immediately I'm thinking about, I forget the right terminology in Dutch. I don't particularly care. But, this idea of the Black helper of Santa Claus, look it up. you couldn't make this shit up. But just because it is Dutch tradition for Santa to have, what's essentially a glorified enslaved person following him around doesn't mean that, this is right. No matter how many warm, rosy feelings around Christmas time maybe your Dutch relatives have about it. It's a fundamentally racist thing. So, do the best you can. Know that you're not going to change everybody's mind, and speak with the knowledge that you are speaking to people who are quietly listening. That's the best I could say on that question, and I'll pass it over to Alex for more on that.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. Great comments for sure on that. This is such a sticky topic, and I'm sure many people find themselves in these kinds of situations at this time of year, and I'm entirely sympathetic. I am often this person at the table alienating my friends and relatives with my social justice speak. Now, I'm half kidding, but I've certainly been there, and I'm sympathetic. So I'm just going to give you some, I think, maybe what I think of as common sense pointers. I think that to begin with, one of the, I think, gems that AJ just mentioned is that it's actually really important to decide when you're going to intervene and when you want to escalate the fight. Because I think often we think of intervening in these kinds of conversations as a fundamentally antagonistic thing. And often that's where, when my dander gets up and I get into it, that's what I do too. But I would encourage all of us who are looking to inject ideas around the fundamental value of human life and dignity into our living situations to also try and do that with even our most intransigent relatives and friends. So thinking about ways that you can, instead of meeting their fire with fire immediately, think about, and this is something I'm going to be honest, I struggle to do myself, so I'm offering it to you only as a piece of advice I try to use as a horizon. Try to think about the nugget in that otherwise awful comment that person has just made, and think about what is the anxiety or the fear that is animating it. So if somebody is going on and on about how, Black folks are inherently more predisposed to criminal activity and so deserve this, awful over-policing, over-carceral response that they are subjected to on a daily basis, try to flip the question, and instead of yelling at them about their racist attitude, and indeed that is a racist attitude, it's factually incorrect, there are all kinds of problems with it. What anxiety are they responding to? Like, are they themselves, have they been victims of crime themselves? Are they fearful of living in an insecure and violent world? Try and ask them a question about, tell me about, what was the last encounter you had when somebody did that to you? And often people, when they're forced, rather than thinking super abstractly about it, I know that, this is my broad characterization of society, asking them to draw on a particular experience. Okay, so tell me about a time when such and such happened. Invites them to reflect on their own experience, and often, kind of invites people to approach the world in a more nuanced and complex way. So I think appealing to the fundamental humanity of people is something we should always try to do. But let's face it, we have lots of friends and relatives who won't go that way and who will double down on their racist assertions. It's always a judgment call about when you decide to meet that fire with fire. As AJ said, I think it's super important in many of these conversations to understand that you are not changing the mind of the person you're arguing with necessarily, but you are setting an example for other people who are witnessing that encounter about what isn't acceptable as social conversation, as ideas to be floated and legitimated around a dinner table. And I think being a bulwark against that, as difficult as that can be sometimes, is really valuable, right? I mean, I hear the concern that so many people will come to us with and say, but it's a family gathering. I don't want to alienate my dad. I don't want to alienate my brother, whomever, right? But if we always use social discomfort as a yardstick, then we are falling into a liberal and bougie morality that will ensure nothing ever changes, right? It's like, oh, it's so gauche for me to stand up for racial justice. Oh, it's so uncomfortable for me to confront patriarchy or homophobia or whatever it is that's being thrown in your face. But flip again, I would invite you, if you're one of those people who feels anxiety around that, flip that again and think about the experience of other people in that room who might be of those identities, or what that brings into the world for those people when you allow it to just slip by you because you don't want to have an uncomfortable conversation with somebody you care about. It's like harm reduction. If you care about somebody, like, your racist dad or your homophobic uncle, then you should want them to live a fully human life, and they will arrive at that by letting go of their desperate clinging to forms of unearned power and privilege, and recognizing that they actually inhabit this world alongside other people. So super tough. Again, I could say more, but I'm going to leave it at that. So try and recognize the fear or anxiety animating the question. Try to meet it in that way. Try to come back to their own experiences. If somebody's being belligerent and antagonistic with you, inviting them to think about experiences where they've either encountered the humanity of those groups they're degrading, or experiences where you're like, okay, well, if you're saying that these people do this thing, tell me about a time when you were subject to that. Like, you say you've had all these awful experiences. Like, let's talk about them, right? As a way of recentering the discussion on them and their ideas, rather than you being forced to perform the social justice mantra for them. And best of luck in the holidays.
Okay, so we just received another question there from the YouTube land. It's a very lengthy contextual lead up, so I'm not going to read all of it, but just to give you a gist of the situation, the person asking the question is involved in the arts, and in particular was engaged with a project that was intended to hold space for BIPOC artists, and then had what looks like an unpleasant experience with a BIPOC artist who said that they didn't want to be involved if white people were controlling the situation, but would be involved if it was BIPOC led. Sorry, I'm paraphrasing. It's a lengthy paragraph, and then it comes down all of this to say ask the following questions: is there no world where a white person can hold space for BIPOC voices if they have a platform? Is this white feminism? Is this really super shady and part of the problem? Okay, thanks for the question. I think there's obviously a lot of emotions coming behind a question like that. So I think what I would say as a non-artist, but a person who's worked with artists and on art, I actually was on the jury with Nocturne a few years ago where some of these issues did come up. It's not a question of whether or not a white person can hold space for BIPOC voices. And I think part of the issue is that it is the space in which space is being held that is the problem. Without getting too conceptual on you there, if BIPOC people are fundamentally involved in shaping that space, then the outcome is going to be something altogether different. Because what a lot of BIPOC people, in my opinion, are not interested in is to simply step into an already configured space that has been designed by white people to serve, a pre-configured conclusion. That's not what diversity and inclusion really ought to be about, but yet in practice, we see that's what diversity and inclusion always is. And what that does is it protects the institutional inertia. So whether it's, an arts festival, whether it's a university, whether it's, like a advertising corporation, the problem is when you want to bring a hold space for BIPOC people, and that space is already formed, then BIPOC people are not able to transform that space. And oftentimes, especially when, you might end up in a situation where you say, okay, well, we have space for one or two BIPOC artists to join this panel, or one or two BIPOC artists to do X or Y. Well, then you're fundamentally setting them up to fail in that structure. And this is part of the reason why I think, certainly why when I'm approached for these sorts of things, why I'm reluctant at times to partake in it, because what it does is it transfers legitimacy and hard work and sweat and toil to the institution in question, right? So you need to think about these things. It's not that there's no way that a white person can work in solidarity with BIPOC people. Of course not. But you have to be really purposeful about the work that you do, the background work you do to build relationships, to integrate perspectives into the design of whatever the output is, whether it's an arts festival or like a university curriculum, et cetera, to actually make those fundamental changes. And that's the stuff that makes it not quote unquote white feminism. What I get from the white feminism reference is, like the kind of well-founded critique that a lot of early feminist theory just fundamentally missed the mark on women of color. Probably speaking from Chandra Mohanty and Gayatri Spivak, they're well-established points from the 80s. So it's not that it's super shady in and of itself, but it is, shady is not the word I would use. I would say it's structurally deficient unless you can actually integrate BIPOC perspectives into the design and, more importantly, the redesign of your institution. And otherwise, you need to really think about, are you prepared to integrate BIPOC voices? Because you haven't necessarily done the work necessary to integrate BIPOC voices into the institution. So sorry to answer with more questions, but I'll pass it over to Alex, and maybe he'll have something a little bit more definitive for you.
Yeah, I doubt I have anything more definitive. I thought that was very, very thorough. But I do. Maybe I'll add a couple of things. I think, I would definitely just support everything that AJ just said. I think it is the one point I'll diverge on is that I think it is a bit shady, to be honest. I think it's shady because it's lazy, and I think it's like when we try to engineer shortcuts or cheat our way to justice, we don't end up there. So I see so many examples of this right now, and so I'm not going to call any of them out because that's gross and very gauche of me. But I think with the best of intentions, I'm going to give people like the best reading on this. I think like 99% of the time when this kind of stuff happens, it's with the best of intentions, and somebody in a position of power decides that they are going to make a big change, and it's going to be and it's going to be seen to be a big change, which is always very important too. And so they are going to open up space and provide a platform or some such thing, or curate, or whatever gross, like contemporary fatty verb inject into that. And not, as AJ has pointed out, fundamentally change the way that power is distributed, that those relationships are lived, that the institutions are built, which is all kind of like pretty unsexy, hard, at least medium-term work, where we're thinking about like, okay, so, here we are in this institution, and this institution does all kinds of like very mundane things, but one of the most important things it does, any institution in society, is it reproduces that society, right? So how can we do things differently? How can we arrange our daily work, our life together in different ways that take power and privilege and platforms somewhat away from those of us who tend to have it and occupy it, and redistribute it to those who don't? And that's a bigger, longer term question that I know is hard to answer, but I think it's really the work that is much more meaningful. But I think fundamentally, if you are a white identified person and you want to be involved in these things, and you're, you're helping to run a festival, or you run a speaker series or a film series, like I used to run at the library, for example, a film and discussion series in the pre-pandemic times, then I think there are indeed ways of like even little initiatives like that where you can open up and really like legitimately seed space and let other people direct the agenda. But it can't be about you setting the terms of their participation and conscripting labor, as AJ is pointing out, and then taking credit for being the one who, established the platform and set the idea in motion. So yeah, I think it's very sticky. There's a lot of nuance here, but yes, it's what we want to avoid is appropriating the struggles and lives and hard work of other people, right? So, ask yourself those basic questions, I think, as you're approaching it, and and be honest with people and be honest about when you make a mistake, because we all will. Back to you, AJ.
Great. Thanks for that, Alex. That's great. If I could just add one little anecdote onto what Alex said, with apologies to my brother. So my brother is a performing artist and has been for a long, long time. And I just wanted to share a quick story of kind of like how this is enacted, sometimes live and in the moment. So when my brother met his now long-term partner, they met in the context of an arts conference where they were talking about diversity. And my brother's partner was on the panel. She's a mixed race person as well, white presenting. And everybody else, as I understand it, on the panel was white, talking about diversity and inclusion in theater. And they got together the night before this panel was supposed to happen and reached out to a large community of BIPOC people who were in their life that they had relationships with and said, what are we going to do about this? So they started the panel, and in a dramatic way, all the white people got up on the panel and left and literally vacated spaces for invited members of the BIPOC community to come in and change the panel. They staged a coup of the panel. You know what I mean? And there are creative ways that you can, if you're willing to put yourself on the line, creative ways that you can intervene in the inertia of these institutions. Because I can tell you, as a person who's organized some massive conferences, there are always people and bureaucracies and rules that are going to say, no, you can't do that. They didn't submit an abstract 3 months ago, so they can't be invited to speak. And you can just give a middle finger to those things in certain contexts. And sometimes that's really necessary. And I always think about that conference where my brother actually met the person that he's with right now. And that was the context in which they met. So to me, that was always just like a beautiful anecdote that I'm borrowing from their life to share with you now. The next question is actually kind of related. It's about cultural appropriation, which is also, I suppose, festive to some extent. So the question is, please explain cultural appropriation. Is it only in a racialized context? So, the context of cultural appropriation is really multifaceted. And I think at the fundamental level, you have to ask yourself, what is the difference between the appropriation of one's culture and the appreciation of one's culture? And the example I always like to turn to is, the juxtaposition of Indian kurtas from the subcontinent, like clothing, shirts in particular, but like textiles. Versus indigenous headdresses and how those have been used as a project of settler colonialism, misused as a project of settler colonialism. So, we're talking 3,000-4,000 years of history in the Indian subcontinent. India used to clothe the entire world. If you read Shashi Tharoor's account of, colonial reparations, one of the points that he makes is that in and around the year 1700 or 1750, I forget what it is, India was responsible for a quarter of global gross domestic product. And then by the year 1900, they were responsible for less than 2% of that. So what changed? In 150 years, the British arrived in India, and something happened that deindustrialized India and enriched England, and in particular on this issue of textile manufacturing. It's the reason why many of us got scattered all over the world. India has a long history of producing beautiful fabric, beautiful spices, beautiful cloth and textiles. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with people all over the world appreciating that. I've seen articles talking about the emergence of the Indian kurta now as like at the pinnacle of like international fashion. And this, those of us who've been wearing it for years, they're damned comfortable clothes too. And they're bright and they're colorful. There's nothing wrong with people, purchasing clothes from one place or another. In order to avoid the appropriation aspect, do a little bit of homework and understand the history that goes into that fabric. Think about, like the ethics associated with wearing it. Is this really the message that you want to convey? And this is something we think about all the time, right? So like, I have some clothes that I bought recently that has indigenous, drawings and symbols on it. And I feel a bit weird at times that I wouldn't wear certain things. In this case, I would wear this because it's directly supporting a political project that is run by indigenous people trying to sell indigenous products for this purpose. So there's an ethics associated with that. And then, you commit to, digging into the history a little bit. That's not always going to be possible, but the opposite extreme takes you, to what we see all the time with all of these, like, young white models just taking anything, assuming that culture is just something that you just pick and choose from a buffet and create this Frankenstein monster. And then, liberalism will tell you that this is cultural mosaic at its finest, but it isn't. What that is appropriation. And it's certainly racialized. Like, to the second part of this question, it's about more than what your intentions are. We hear this all the time. Well, I want to appreciate this culture. I want to love up this culture and stuff. Well, if you want to appreciate and love up the culture, then you really have to understand its history and its cultural context. And that's not something that is just impossibly difficult to do. It's just something that requires you to do a little bit of homework. You know what I mean? So think about what you buy. And I would argue that you should be doing that with everything that you're buying in this period of advanced capitalism. But anyway, I'm going to pass it over to Alex to speak to this one.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. Yes, good question for sure. The rabbit hole of cultural appropriation. I mean, I think that there's certain, like, just like talking as an anthropologist here, on the one hand, I'd say at like the most abstract level, human groups have always encountered one another, traded, borrowed from each other, learned from each other. That's a completely legitimate thing to do, right? You encounter another people and their way of living, and you are inspired by something. And as AJ says, the natural response to that ought to be to learn about it, to learn about what its meaning is, to explore whether or not in that context it's appropriate for you to be able to embrace it, to take it into your own life, or whether it's something that doesn't really belong to you. And I think, white identified people can think about this too, right? I'm not at all a religious person. Part of my ancestry, my mom's people are Protestants, but let's say I was super interested and inspired by religious or Christian art and iconography. Is it my right to adorn myself in those kinds of symbols, or to have I don't know, like pictures of stained glass, church stained glass all over my house, even though I disavow the idea of Christianity and its practices? I think lots of Christians would be offended by that. They would say our religion isn't your sort of like abstract art. Yeah, right back at you. So there are all kinds of things in this world that aren't meant for people who are not practitioners of that particular culture, right? So I think we have very obvious examples. Yes, you dressing up as somebody else's way of life for Halloween is a racist thing to do, and you should always avoid doing it. Other people's ways of living are not your playground. They're just not. And I think anybody could understand that in the context of their own life. Does that mean white people shouldn't do yoga? No, that doesn't mean that white people should not do yoga. It means that approaching that practice hopefully means learning something about it and its roots, and coming to appreciate the people, the cultures that gave birth to that practice. And I love martial arts. I study Japanese jiu-jitsu, right? I'm not a Japanese person. I have no Japanese ancestry. I don't see it as a form of cultural appropriation to be studying a martial art that wasn't innovated by my own ancestors. But I certainly do try and learn something about the roots of that practice, and it's built into the way that it's taught and the culture from which it came. Yeah, I mean, I think that cultural appropriation is a tricky term. Like, for me, it does. There are times where I think the line is drawn too starkly, and where we have to be, and it's a problem because we live in an extremely unjust, unequal world. So I would suggest that the onus is on those of us who are reaching out into that world to grab those things and bring them into our own lives, to be careful and judicious and to learn about them before we do that. Because it's an easy thing to do when you are the one on the side of power, that you're kind of enjoying that opportunity. You're sort of reaching out into that, what you see as a cultural grab bag of experience to pull out whatever you want. It's easy to do a lot of violence in that context, right? When you don't have the ability to engineer that cultural marketplace, I think you see things very differently. So there are certainly certain kinds of adornment, ritual, cultural practice that I wouldn't engage in, right? But the example that AJ gave about Indigenous art, I think is a wonderful one. I have a few hoodies and T-shirts designed by Indigenous artists. They're usually about some political struggle, and I'm happy to wear that, proud to wear those things, even though they don't come from my own people, because I was invited to do that as an ally. I was invited to support, invited to wear those things, and to kind of broadcast my support for those struggles into the world. But I certainly would not engage in appropriating somebody's regalia in the same way. That's not okay. So yeah, be thoughtful, be nuanced, be aware of the power dynamics that animate your ability to access other people's lives and the things that come along with them, and begin there with your questions about whether or not this is a thing you ought to be doing or not. But always ask the question.
All right. Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. I was thinking while you were speaking to that too, there's often a tendency, and this is related, this is maybe because I'm grading history papers, but it's also, there's a tendency in kind of Western modernity to think that history starts now, that's this recent thing. The truth is, cultures have been mixing, intermixing, sharing for thousands and thousands of years. It's one of the most profoundly human things, and in particular, when you look at the relationships historically between Southeast Asia and East Asia and South Asia and Africa, these were vibrant places where globalization, non-capitalist globalization perhaps, but globalization nonetheless has been the defining aspect of the so-called ancient world. I don't even like the description of the ancient world, because ancient compared to what, right? Like it betrays the presentism. So, there have always been ways that cultures have met and negotiated differences, and sometimes it's been awful and sometimes it's been wonderful. So, don't think that these things are happening now for the very first time. And then the flip side of that is even in the right now, like one quick other little anecdote, just because I'm staring at it right here, is that, I was gifted one time an eagle feather by an Anishinaabe friend. And it's very meaningful to me that she would choose to give this to me. But the significance of an eagle feather in, Algonquin territory is different from the significance of an eagle feather in Mi'kmaq territory. And I didn't know that. So I made that mistake that I was carrying an eagle feather, and I'm not qualified to have an eagle feather based on where I am now in Mi'kmaq. So I would never, I want to honor the fact that this was a gift, so I keep it. But I would never, I would never use this. I would never bring it into a classroom or anything like that, because I'm not qualified based on the conventions that are here. So all that to say, don't assume that there is a pan-Indigenous perspective on something or a pan-Asian perspective on something. Everything is specific to the context and where you are. And that's part of the process of doing the work. And that work shouldn't be seen as a burden. That work should be seen in some ways as a sense of joy, because it allows you to deepen your understanding of the environments in which you're embedded. So the next question we have is about microaggressions. Can you explain microaggressions and how we can avoid them? Okay, so microaggressions, what I use in my teaching on microaggressions, there's this beautiful 2-minute video that if you just type in saying, microaggressions is like a mosquito bite or something like that, it does a better job than I could ever do in terms of explaining microaggressions. But I'll try anyway here. Basically a microaggression is something that cumulatively leads someone to snap because they under the weight and the pressure of it all. But individually, it might seem like nothing significant. That's why the example of the mosquito bite is so useful. But if you got 30 mosquito bites in an hour, you would probably go running, unless you're from Ontario and Lake Country or something like that. But so a microaggression can take lots of different forms. It can be gender oriented, it can be race oriented, it can be class oriented. This is one that's not at all particular to race. And in a nutshell, it's just really kind of stupid, ignorant questions that don't actually need to be asked for the most part. They don't even necessarily all have to be questions. But so in terms of how can you avoid them, the key is, you're gonna screw up and you're gonna microaggress all the time. I do it too. Like for people who are outside of your lived experience, if you want to do better, what you have to do is learn from your mistakes. So when it happens, don't kind of like turn into a shell and get defensive about it. Instead, appreciate if the person that you are aggressing against, appreciate the fact that they may tell you about it. They may not. You may have to read cues. And what I would suggest is that you document it. So write it down. When I say document it, I mean literally write it down. Keep a notebook of aggressions or something, and revisit it and reflect on that in terms of thinking about what might I do differently, right? So the classic examples that we hear about all the time are, really dramatic things like, people trying to touch Black people's hair. I've never seen. It is astounding to me the degree to which like that sort of thing still happens. As a hairless person, perhaps it's extra hard to understand this, but there are other things. Like I had a student one time. It was a child, and we were in another country. Who I was teaching English, and she came up to me and tried to rub the dirt off my hand one time, saying like, teacher, you're so dirty. I'm not going to be pissed at a little kid for doing something like that, but it speaks to the broader kind of like understanding of that which is normal, right? So if you want to avoid engaging in microaggressions against people who are different from you across a variety of intersections, you have to kind of think about your questions more before you pose them. Like, do you need to say, like, if you're going to say Merry Christmas to somebody and you think, oh, are they going to be offended because they're a Muslim? Then don't say like, Merry, Happy Hanukkah, whatever it is that you do, That's a real example. That happened to a person that I know literally yesterday. So, think about it before you speak. And I think that does speak to some of the structural aspects of privilege associated with white. Is that whiteness over the last several hundred years, because it has been presented as normal, white people have an inflated sense of the public space that they're entitled to take up. And as a result of that, they believe that, people have to answer the questions, you know what I mean? In ways that like the rest of us probably would never actually think about that. And that's, again, not just a whiteness thing. That's a hetero thing as well. Like if a hetero person, cisgendered person, they all think that they're entitled to whatever the deviant knowledge is, whether that's, religion, whether that's sexuality, whatever it is. So the real key, in my opinion, as a person who accidentally engages in microaggressions all the time, because I speak my mind maybe too much sometimes, is I try and write it down, document it, think about what I would do different next time. So I'll pass it over to Alex to say more on that.
I don't think I can answer that question better, and I'm less nuanced and thoughtful in my approach to these particular kinds of interactions than AJ. I'm not going to lie. So I'm there with people who feel flummoxed by this sometimes. I'm going to be really honest too here and say I really dislike the language, the term microaggression, not because of what it signals, but because of what it, like, for me, what it says about how kind of like activisty and sort of like jargony so much social justice speak has become. For me, it's a big turnoff. As somebody who grew up, and I would characterize what I experience now, if I wanted to, as microaggression. So, like, I can be a pretty white presenting person, especially in the colder parts of the years, and I speak, as I've been told when I lived in Mexico for a while, that I have a really like slow Canadian accent. So like culturally, I'm a pretty white guy, But because my last name is Kasnabish, even growing up in Toronto, like I used to have schoolmates who would, not only struggle with the name or intentionally make fun of it or whatever, but also ask me all the time, like, where are you from? Where are you from? Right. So, and I would say, well, I'm from Toronto because I was born in Toronto. Right. So, and in every other way, and this was sort of like part of my experience. Like it was so, I get this right through like my undergrad. I mean, I still get this sometimes. Where are you from? even though, in my head, I present as such a sort of like generic white person in so many ways, right? And I say that like not in any way to offend white people or to offend myself. I'm just like, yeah, like that's who I am. But this is a signal for people who, who are genuinely curious and they want to know about the origin of my last name. But ask it in completely offensive ways. And I think, you can imagine like somebody being like, just feeling entitled to ask you something in that way that seems to diminish your legitimacy as an inhabitant of that space, or your tenure there, or something like that. And it's just in those like really banal everyday ways that those hierarchical relations of power that we call racism, because they're configured around this notion of difference, of group difference and hierarchical group difference, are lived and reproduced on a daily basis. Of course, on the other hand, it's like the police killing of Black and Indigenous people. It's the incredible over-incarceration of those same groups. It's the systematic denial of decent services to those groups. It's their proximity to toxic industries. The list goes on and on and on. We can itemize all those other things that are much more dramatic, of course, in terms of our catalog of racism. But really, for many people, it's what AJ's talking about. It's that daily work of having to kind of steel yourself against the, whatever it is you do at this time of year, you kooky people. And I think, sometimes people say that kind of stuff out of nervousness, out of insecurity, out of like, I'm going to try and be funny and self-effacing, but in fact, you come across as an arrogant asshole. So. And I think this comes back to why we create a space like this, to answer these kinds of questions and to get us to think thoughtfully about how we might engage those good faith curiosities about other people's ways of living. So if you're curious about somebody, just admit that you are interested in them and their lives, and you don't know much, and you're going to ask a question. That's fine. Like everybody, like, most people anyway, I won't say everybody, most people enjoy the opportunity to talk about themselves and are happy to tell you something about their lives, but not if you ask a question that seems to degrade or disparage or reduce their humanity as something like less than your own, right? So, this is, I think, the careful work that AJ is pointing to, that if you start to keep a kind of a catalog of these things, you're like, oh man, I really do ask these kinds of questions consistently, and that person was offended, and that person was offended, and that person was offended, and maybe I should then do the work to make sure I'm communicating differently. This is just like, people want to suggest that this is some kind of like, ideological remaking of you. That's not what we're talking about. We're actually talking about the basic work of being a better, more decent human in relation to other humans. So stop acting as if your experience is the baseline against which everything else gets measured, and instead treat yourself as one unique creature amongst a sea of other unique creatures who also have the right to exist and have their experiences, and engage them that way. And I think then, you don't have to worry about coming up with fancy terminology for what is really the basic work of acknowledging the mutuality of our existence. And, how I like to frame it, this work of undoing racism as a work of collective liberation. This isn't white people losing. This is everybody winning. So back to you, AJ.
Thanks very much, Alex. So we are coming up close to time. We do have some questions in the queue, so I'm going to we'll try and be a little bit brief so we can get to all of them here. So the next question says, I'm trying to create spaces for white people to learn about their role and responsibility as white people in white supremacy, and inspire them to work towards racial justice. Awesome. However, I feel that most of my learning has come from feminist, queer, BIPOC people. I am acknowledging where my knowledge comes from. I plan to give away part of my earning if I should start to earn money with it. I am wondering how I can do this racial justice work in a good way, and how to deal with profiting even more from the system that privileges me in the first place. Thanks for that question. That's a very significant question, I think, that speaks to the intersections of class and race in particular, and acknowledge and historical erasure, of like BIPOC knowledge in the making of world history. So I guess what I would say, first and foremost, it's super important for white people to educate other white people. That is so essential because it takes the burden off of BIPOC people just a little bit. And it allows them, this is the important part, it allows BIPOC people to maybe to learn and develop in ways that is not always trying to like pander to a basic level understanding of race. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why Alex and I do this work, although we're not white people. So it's great to hear that white people are doing this work. And eventually, if enough white people do this work, Alex and I will retire from this work and we won't do it at all. So by all means, keep it up. So the other thing I would say is that there are ways, since you've identified that material aspect of the work, you should think maybe about partnering with BIPOC people, so that maybe you're not the expert at the front of the room, but rather there's two or more of you who are delivering these in tandem. So if you're designing some kind of a business or something, like reach out to recruit, collaborate with other people who are also doing this kind of anti-racist work, and see if you can find a way not just to spread the wealth as a complete project, but actually integrate different perspectives into the education that you're seeking to do, and reward it appropriately. Always cite your sources. That's great. And another way to do this, if it's just not practical to, like build a whole company or something on anti-racism, although I feel like it probably is quite possible these days. You see, certain people who have made a killing doing this work, especially the white people who do the work. So I think it's really important to also identify what BIPOC projects are where you live, and to contribute to them. So, just because it's at the top of my mind, there's like the African Freedom School here in Mi'kma'ki is a good project that started up recently, and was like, I don't know if you're asking this question from Mi'kma'ki, but giving a financial contribution to an organization engaged in that kind of work, the work of Black liberation, that is a concrete way to make a difference. And there are lots of projects, grassroots initiatives that need financial support wherever it is in the world that you are. So I would suggest checking that out, and I'm going to pass it to Alex.
Yeah, all great suggestions. In the interest of keeping it brief, I would say a couple of things. Like, I think I would really encourage people, especially white identifying people, to not approach this in a professionalization kind of way. Do not start, please don't start another NGO or consultancy group about this, particularly just, sort of like splintering off on the theme of racial justice. For me, unless you're talking about the way that oppression and exploitation as structured relations in society intertwine, you're only seeing a part of the puzzle. So it's very hot right now to be concerned about racial justice. But unless we are understanding that these, racism as a system, only exists in order to also make possible a world where some people can live off the lives and labor of other people, that it's not just a thing about some groups being more fully evolved humans, seeing themselves in that way, but it's also about that material, the material theft of life and wealth from people that's sustained by that, then you're missing it. You end up in a space where you kind of do the liberal hand-holding kumbaya stuff, without actually addressing the fact that there are material reasons that groups have been set up to be dispossessed and exploited and degraded in order that others may benefit from them. And so just keep that firmly in mind when you're doing your work. As AJ says, don't set up a platform for yourself. Don't forward yourself as an expert in this way, when you very well may not be. And find ways, I would say, of working with grassroots groups if you can. There is a strata in societies like ours, especially, where you will find yourself in diverse settings, but with people who are very much engaged in the work of commodifying and profiting off of grassroots community-based struggle and knowledge. So don't make the assumption that just because you're surrounded by other people who might speak the language you do or have the same convictions, that you're actually engaged in grassroots social justice work. That's really where your commitment should be. And in really like finding ways to circulate that knowledge in the spaces you live and work. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks for that, Alex. I realize we're out of time. There is just one last question here, so maybe we can take it up and then I'll say a few things, pass it to Alex, and Alex will sign off for us. But this one is a follow-up question from the person who was asking earlier about whether or not white people can be victims of racism. And they go on to say, well, a lot of context, what about if it was in India or in the Congo or any country in Africa or Asia except for South Africa? Isn't it possible that if the white person was in a minority they had constant discrimination similar to something that a black person could endure, would that be considered prejudicial still, or is that considered racist? So, okay, the reason I want to follow up with this one, in part because I think it's a good illustration of kind of what's wrong with engaging in hypotheticals all the time. You know what I mean? So I would just urge you to look up Amir Rahman's stand-up comedy sketch called Reverse Racism. And it just does such a beautiful job of laying it out. But some of the countries you mentioned here, you mentioned Congo and India as examples. You need to look for how white supremacy manifests in those societies. Just because white people aren't the dominant group doesn't mean that white supremacy as a structure doesn't continue to affect how people think. Like this, Amir Rahman talks about how people have learned to hate the color of their skin, eyes, and hair. Like this is part of it. So to take your hypothetical to its logical conclusion, only if over hundreds of years and generations of where, like privilege has been set up, then maybe at that point that could happen. But because we're talking about structures, it's just not possible, because as a white person in the Congo who doesn't understand the history of Congo, which is a horrific history of white supremacy, do look that one up. Anyway, I could give you sources on it, but you can leave there, and then your whiteness kind of frees you from that burden in ways that you could never do if you weren't white. So it is just simply not equatable to think about it in that way. And do check out Amir Rahman. I'll pass it over to Alex now to conclude.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. Yeah, just because I cannot not weigh into this answer, I would say, like, all good faith present here. I hear this a lot. This is one of those like hypotheticals that gets floated that it's the devil's advocacy stuff. I would really encourage you to, if you're curious about this, there is so much to actually learn about real things in the world rather than troubling yourself with hypotheticals that literally don't exist. You can't find a society on the face of the earth that has the kind of legalized, structured, institutionalized forms of white supremacy that we see right here in the Canadian state. I mean, like, look up Canadian immigration laws. Right up and through the 1960s, Canada's immigration laws were explicitly white supremacist and discouraged black immigration, like any kind of racialized immigration to this country. And indeed, you could argue that legacy has continued thoroughly. Look at the briefs about who the RCMP feels free to surveil and intervene with, which organizations, which movements. Look at the systematic attempts in the United States in this latest presidential election debacle to systematically disenfranchise racialized voters. And there is no other way to describe what the Republican Party is trying to do in this current moment, but that you cannot show me another example in the world of that happening to white people as white people. Okay. Now, the Nazis, if you want to go back to this, yes, they killed white people too. They thought, for example, Slavs were subhumans, but they did not kill them as white people, right? They killed them as in their scientific racist hierarchy, as groups that did not fit into whiteness. Actually, they killed them precisely because they saw them as non-white people. So indeed, even in those circumstances where you'd be like, oh, these are white people killing other white people. No, because from the Nazis' perspective, those people weren't whites. So You can imagine being poorly treated in another part of the world. It's like, when I was in Mexico and somebody would call me a gringo. Well, first of all, I am a gringo. It's fine. I wasn't really offended by that. But, that's not like you could say, oh, that's so racist. Oh, my God, I feel so offended. Yes. And who had the right with a Canadian passport to travel literally unmolested, undisturbed from end to end in that country, to leave whenever I wanted? When I was on a bus traveling to Chiapas, where I was doing my field work, we were stopped by immigration police at checkpoints consistently, right? And it was the Mexicans who are actually subject to the greatest scrutiny. Me as an ambiguously racialized person, and at the time I was traveling with my mom, who is so pale, she is nearly translucent, were left almost entirely unmolested in those circumstances. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about racism. We're not talking about your hurt feelings. We're not talking about somebody called you a Kevin or a Karen, and now you're wounded by it. We're talking about the way society is organized to present wealth, resources, opportunity, and an elevated sense of one's own place in the world and humanity over and above other groups. So in those cases, I would challenge you to come up with an actual example that fits that test, where white people systematically are being disenfranchised, dispossessed, degraded, and treated institutionally in that way. And I have yet to see an example where that's true. I mean, people point to the Irish in the context of the United States, but again, that's precisely proving the example. The Irish were regarded as degraded whites and had to prove that they were white by being used as a tip of a spear against other racialized groups, especially Black people in the context of the United States, and putting down Black uprising, Black rebellion. And David Roediger is an amazing white historian of whiteness in the context of the United States, has written so eloquently about the use of the color line in demobilizing solidarity across racialized boundaries in the context of the United States, and why that works so effectively in the interests of the ruling class. So much could be said here. I'm going to stop myself there. I would just say, like, to white folks, please stop with the hypotheticals. You can imagine if aliens came down and blah, 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 all these things. Until that happens, let's deal with the reality we have in front of us, which is a system of structured, intentional white power and white supremacy that's been, in most cases, legalized, structured through law and institutions, that has led to demonstrable negative outcomes, health-wise, economically, socially, and politically, for groups identified as being less than human. And let's deal with that problem first. Once we, as to quote Rahman again, once we defeat Nazis on Earth, then we can talk about defeating them elsewhere in the universe. But until we've done that, I'd rather I'm paraphrasing. He's actually he makes a slightly different analogy, but then we can go on to do those things. For now, let's stick with what's in front of us. Thank you so much, folks, for those of you who joined us live today. Thanks so much to our friends at Fernwood for supporting this and making these events possible. Thanks to my co-host and co-conspirator, AJ. And we invite you back here. This is an ongoing series. We'll be back here in approximately a month's time, towards the end of January, with our next session. Hopefully you can join us then. Send your questions in advance, ask at the time. And feel free to check out the recordings of these events, this one included on YouTube. So for the rest of this holiday season, please be well, have those difficult conversations, and let's do this hard work of collectively liberating ourselves from these relations that make all of our lives less full, less democratic, less peaceful, and less sustainable. So thanks, folks. See you soon.
Thank you.